Here we find ourselves walking through the temple of Seti at Abydos. From what I understand, he wasn't quite able to finish it, and then the fabled Ramses the second that we know of, his son, another redhead, finished it. Something I want to talk about as we look at this depiction here. We walk down the hallway and we can see a picture of this on the wall. And this would have been Seti talking to Ramses as a child and explaining and giving the lineage, going through the kings and the king's list that we know of, well, not the one that we know of, and describing everything through time that had led up to them. One thing about this list is it goes much farther than the current list that we go with. There's a few lists that go back much further, but current ways that people want to discern or perceive the civilization have decided that before a certain point here it becomes mythological and they couldn't have kept up with their own lineage. Yet there's something about memory, something that we kind of leave today. An example of which is I can go through my lifetime when whenever I was a child I had to memorize 20 or 30 or more phone numbers. And in that process I also had a combination lock or two. I can still tell you from the age of 4 or 5 the address of pretty much every place that I lived and that number that goes along with it, all the way up until I became older and started living in apartments and things like that back and forth. But yet some of those actually I flash in my memory I can do. And in modern day people don't do that. They rely on phones and things to have it in there, and therefore you don't memorize that number as much, although whenever you see it you'd memorize it. But most people put the person's name in there and therefore don't quite have that. They don't go through it. Things like this used to be gone through almost on a daily basis by priests. While it seems like you're looking at just symbols next to symbols next to symbols and it means nothing, each one of these they would recite the person's name and then say something about it. This was taught to somebody like a Padawan, and it went through time and through father and son, scribes and such. And they were able to keep it well enough. From what I understand, there was a person able to, at one time, and the Greeks had put it down, talk through the 300 pharaohs that had come before him. Manetho's list seems to come from this, but there are a few different varieties, and there are some places where people are missing. And I guess that's maybe where we'll veer with this video that we're doing here, is the idea of somebody just being written out of history totally. Because even though this is the 19th dynasty that we're talking about, and very famous, Seti and then Ramses the Great and so on, what had come just before was the most famous of, which we know of from King Tut, the boy king, and all of his accoutrements that we have that show what the great pharaohs had. Well, we now know that that whole Amarna period people's stuff was all shoved in there, and that was one of the women's tombs and so on. Strangely enough, right here, whenever you get on this list, they don't even have it on there. They took the trouble of scraping it out and putting plaster back over it and rewriting another person's name. In fact, the Pharaoh Eye, Akhenaten, Tut, even Hatshepsut. Not shown. Not even talked about. It's weird. It's almost like that dynasty never existed. This happened a few times. In fact, that's why the King's List is really not quite correct. Because if anybody messed up too bad and so on, and pissed off enough people, I guess you'd say, they'd get written out of history. Now, this isn't like the video I did recently where someone gets their nose knocked off. That's in a different way. That's when somebody steals their heritage and their things and rewrites over it and knows that their spirit's going to be pissed off. So to keep the ghost off their shoulders, they go and bust that statue, and of course that stops their afterlife, effectively, or their effect on the earth anymore. Which is kind of like what we're talking about, but something a little bit different. But sure enough, as you look down this list, there are some people that are not on this list. Also, we could talk about there are people on this list that people don't really know anything about, and that might be a version of what we're about to talk about too. Let's take a look at this a little bit deeper in this concept where someone can just disappear. There is a concept called Damnatio Memory. It's one of those Latin terms, comes out of a Greek term and so on, but what this basically means is condemnation of memory. And of course you hear about somebody damning somebody, and that's kind of what they're trying to say whenever they say that, but in a modern day we don't really even know what that means. It just means bad on you, right? Or whatever. This is indicating that a person is to be excluded from official accounts, though. He just kind of gets ghosted. In a way, this is the ancient cancel culture, if you will. There are and have been many routes to damnatio memory, including the destruction of depictions of people, statues, if you will, in the modern day sometimes. But that doesn't work really, because you'd have to take it all away. But the removal of names from inscriptions and documents, and even large-scale rewritings of history. And it's happened. There are inklings of that happening, and I show you that in some other videos here. The term can be applied to other instances of official scrubbing. The practice is seen as long ago as the aftermath of the reign of the Egyptian pharaohs Akhenaten in the 13th century BC and Hatshepsut in the 14th century BC. They kind of just took them out of being a little bit, if you will. So although the term damnatio memory is Latin, the phrase is not used by the ancient Romans and first appeared in the dissertation written in Germany by a man in 1689. So it's not what they would call it. There were other terms for this, but in a way this was just ghosting somebody as to they never even existed. Best known preserved to this day examples of damnatio memory in antiquity concern chiseling stone inscriptions or deliberately omitting certain information from them. You can see this all over the Egyptian art, where instead of doing the nose smacking I was talking about and so on, and just trying to stop them from being able to be pissed off back at you and have a ghost spirit on you, they would just chisel the person out of existence. And usually as cartouche here too. And in some instances chiseled the cartouche out and put somebody else's cartouche in. But whenever that happened, because they were using the same symbology and the same looking type device, they would just change the names. We've seen how Ramses was guilty of doing this quite a bit, where he went around, and either if he fixed up some of the places a little bit or whatever, in doing so he put his name over a lot of places. Again, whether he fixed them back up or not, it doesn't change the fact that it actually used to be called someplace else. If the Chrysler building suddenly got bought by somebody else and had some name put onto it, and IBM was running it now, it would still be called the Chrysler building, wouldn't it? Well, no, not actually. And maybe, and it would drift away and there would be a memory of it. Of course, if there was something real bad that happened with Chrysler, or not the cars or something, you have to figure it in. Something like this could go on. It's a strange effect, but it basically tries to write somebody out of history, and in effect, in a modern day, it kind of worked, because due to the way history worked and our own omissions, we've kind of lost a lot of people. Short of just some gravestones and so on, a lot of people in a modern day might get lost to time in history. They haven't done something so fantastical, and in a modern day it's extremely more difficult than it would have been in an elder time to have stood out among a crowd. Crowds weren't as big and so on, if you will. But it happened in a lot of places. Ancient Mesopotamia, according to Stephen Zadowski, the oldest known examples of such practices come from around 3000 BC. He cites the example of Agash, an ancient city that's founded by the Sumerians in southern Mesopotamia, where preserved inscriptions concerning a conflict with another city-state. So this was internal, and somebody was famed and had their name, and they were running that area, like we've talked about in Sumer. This city-state was known as Umma. He did not mention the ruler of Umma when this went down, but described him as the man from Umma. Not even the priest king, the ruler of it, or whatever, and give him an epitaph like they have now. Just the man. Which Zadowski sees as an example of deliberate degradation of the ruler of Umma, a role of unworthy person whose name and position in history the rules of Lagash did not want to record for posterity. And then he just really got omitted from history, and nobody knew who this ruler was, but an uprising and wanted to go against somebody, and then whash, and then nobody even knew who he was anymore. The victor's always known, though, and so it was still kept. Ancient Egyptians also practiced this, as seen in relics from Pharaoh Akhenaten's tomb and elsewhere. His worship was restricted to the one god Aten instead of the many gods common to the to the time, considered heretical. In fact, they call him the heretic king. During this reign, Akhenaten himself attempted to have all references of the god Amun chipped away. So this is a version of it too. And to stop the worship of that after his reign, temples to Aten were dismantled and the stones were used to create other temples. Images to Akhenaten had their faces chipped away, and images after his reign were taken away, and references to Amun all of a sudden reappeared. People blamed their misfortunes on Akhenaten's shift of worship to Atenism. And of course, this was taken away of the power of the church and away from the gods that they served before him, which was just a sun god too. I've talked about how this was just a culmination in a monotheism idea. You see, the thing that started overwhelming these people, and later the Greeks and Romans that we know about, is that all their gods that are related to stars, that we well know, right? And the wandering stars, the planets, and they're all associated with this, and the concepts aren't wandering stars. Their name still shows you that they had this effect, and one of the ideas, you look at the Sumerians and all the din gear, and it's a star symbol. So it's well known, but also they started figuring out that no, like the Sumerians said at one time, all those stars you're seeing in the sky aren't just little bitty dots that fall when you call it a falling star, and it's just a little bitty meteorite. Those are like our sun, which is giant, but they're way far in the distance, like somebody who walked far away with a torch to where it's just a little dot. And there's a lot of them. And those wandering stars that we call stars are really something else. We call them planets, but planet actually means wandering stars. It still keeps that inside of it. And so the concept was from the very origin and the starting of all these religions that this had all delved down to was a sun worship. In fact, the Bible even encourages this idea, and others I'll get into in a minute, on the fact that let there be light, and the sun starting its nuclear furnace that's inside of it gave life to everything. Didn't happen in a day and so on. In fact, days are built on the fact that we're spinning and it's not, and all these other effects. But in an elder day, people didn't know all this science, really, did they? And the common person didn't really know it. It was easy to pull the wool over somebody's eyes, especially by the time it had gotten steeped into stuff and people actually had cultured wool right there to pull over your eyes. So, another Egyptian victim of this practice was the Pharaoh Eye. The campaign of Damnatio Memory against Akhenaten and eyes was initiated by the later successor, and Horemheb, who decided to erase from history all pharaohs associated with the unpopular Amarna period. We're just going to pretend that never happened. And so amazingly, once you write them off, and you go a few generations and people aren't allowed to talk about it, they pretty much disappeared, huh? Till modern archaeology comes along and says, oh, what's this? And then we find a tomb, and another that are from this period, and that led to King Tut and a reality of this situation. So it says this process was continued by Horemheb's successor, or successors. The practice was also known in ancient Greece, although in some ways you'll never hear about it again, and you never knew about it because you never heard about it. Another example of damnatio memory is the punishment in ancient Greece was the one meted out by the peoples of Ephesus after Herostratus set fire to the temple of Artemis, one of the 7 wonders of the world of antiquity. Felons in that time would be erased from history for the crimes they had committed. Even if they had done something cool and been somebody good that were going to be written into the book of life, if they ended up being, something that, you could fill in the blank right here, and especially in a modern day, you could fill in the blank with other stuff, all of a sudden, they get canceled. Kind of an ancient cancel culture. Ancient Rome. In ancient Roman society, a Roman's house was perceived as an extension of his self. It signaled to divine protectors a social and genealogical status to the world outside. Similarly, just as the domus, or home, domicile, would have been seen as an extension of the self, memory was thought of as one of the best ways to understand the self. In a society without much written documentation back then, memory training was a big part of Roman education and had been since before recorded time, actually. That's why in the Bible they have this idea that somebody before writing was able to sit and decipher and keep up with the fact that there were people all the way from Adam on down, and it was believed by so many people, even though it only records some 4,000 years or so, and then plus what happens after. Orators, leaders, and poet alike use memory training devices or memory palaces to help give speeches and tell long epic poems. Like I talked about in Asclepius, how he was walking by statues when he was saying this, and that giving that aspect changes the whole story from what you would think of if you didn't have that aspect. In natural history, Pliny writes, it would be far from easy to pronounce what person has been the most remarkable for the excellence of his memory, that blessing so essential for the enjoyment of life. There being so many that were celebrated for it, King Cyrus knew all the soldiers of his army by name. Scipio knew the names of all the Roman people at one time. So, finding out things like that whenever I was a kid and having a hard way keeping up with something, in history class always being terrible with numbers and stuff going on, and then you have that BC effect, so years before present becomes different. Memory palaces provide an aid for remembering certain key ideas by assigning locations in their homes for different ideas. Poets or the ilk would walk back and forth through their house, recalling ideas with every step. You see, they would not remember. There was this thing that we do nowadays when you can't remember your keys, and then what are you supposed to do? You're supposed to go right back through what you were just doing. And you go back, and all of a sudden you go, and I put them down right here on the counter. And, it's just kind of a rewind situation. But also doing that rewind, if you want to, and you had this thought one day when you went outside and sat down and did this, well, you had a bunch of days you did this, but just recalling that moment would help you to recall all the memory of that moment. Hopefully most of the people listening understand what I'm talking about. So, memory training often involved assigning ideas to wall paintings, floor mosaics, and sculptures that adorn many Roman homes. The punishment of Damnatio Memory involved altering those rooms, many times destroying or tampering with the art in their homes as well, so the house would no longer be identifiable as the perpetrator's home. This would in turn erase the perpetrator's very existence because his memories were trapped in the fact of him walking back and forth. You can imagine in a time whenever people were real ghost sensitive and so on, that they would take and plaster over such a situation, and other times they would try to chip off all the plaster and take it away and redo another one. And it necessarily wouldn't be to take away that person's memory, but be able to put your own on your own wall, for you have your own life. And it may not necessarily go with all those pictures that are in there. Luckily, with places like Pompeii, we can actually see a moment in time where this didn't happen, clusterfuck all over the place. In ancient Rome, the practice of damnatio memory was the condemnation of Roman elites and emperors after their deaths. If the Senate or later emperor did not like the acts of an individual, they'd have his property seized, his name erased, and his statues reworked and plasters redone in his house and sold off to somebody. Because there's an economic incentive to seize property and rework statues, historians and archaeologists have difficulty determining when official damnatio memory even actually took place. Although it seems to have been quite rare from the pieces that we can even find, but if they did it good enough, it doesn't exist at all. Sadly, when this happens, one way that you can only find it is if this person is in a list or something that was so valuable they kept, and all they did was chip it out. And then if you can find another version of that where it shows that person, or you can figure out who that was. Compounding this difficulty is the fact that the complete successful damnatio memory results by definition in the full and total erasure of the subject from the historical record. In actual practice, however, it's unlikely that such complete successes were possibly except in cases where the individual in question was of limited contemporary notability, as even comprehensive obliteration of a person's existence and actions and records and the like would continue to be historically visible without extensive reworking. Well, this is how we find most, if any of them. But if the person was a little less well known, it gets dropped away. What comes to mind is all the people that were inventors in ancient time that had stuff that was like at the Library of Alexandria that everybody talks about as if it's just the only key point. But people that were there would study what was there from before that people had put, and they'd put two and two together and come up with something. Like I've talked about Archimedes' screw being an ancient Sumerian, what fueled the ancient gardens of Babylon. That predates the hell out of him. But yet we call it an Archimedes screw. Not to take anything away from him, for he's, even in his name that was given him, he is archetypal of the Medes people and things that all happened through there and who they used to be. But that's for another video. So, the impracticality of such a cover-up would be vast. In the case of the Emperor Geta, for example, it appears that coins bearing his effigy continued to circulate for years after his condemnation, even though the mere mention of his name was punishable by death. It's one of those situations where we just don't talk about it and it goes away, and then after a couple of generations, you won't hear about it again. Well, sadly, there's still some coins. What did they do? Well, anytime they got one of those coins, they'd take and smack it till it didn't have that on it anymore, and then throw that in a melt pile. So the sense of expression of damnatio memory and of the sanction is to remove every trace of a person from life if they never existed, in order to preserve the honor of the city, really. In a city that stressed social appearance, respectability, and the pride of being a true Roman as a fundamental requirement of the citizen, it's perhaps the severest, most severe punishment. In the Middle Ages, heresiarchs would have had their memory condemned. The Council of Constance decreed the damnatio memory of John Wycliffe. Funny how we have Wycliffe John. The practice of replacing pagan beliefs and motifs with Christian. Just taking everything that was there right there and putting a cross into it. In some cases you didn't have to. And purposely not recording the pagan history has been compared to damnatio memory as well. See if I can give you an example here and go through an idea that'll hook up with the Bible and something that we maybe recognize. You see, round about 72, 73 AD, there was a person that was crucified, and this is recorded by Josephus, as of having found him there. Try to say that 3 times fast. And he recognized the people. Now, he prayed for their being let down. And whenever they did, one was already dead, one died shortly after, and one miraculously lived. Now, this person, who ends up being attached to apparently King Isis of Odessa, was apparently said to have been initiate and someone who helped along in a large way, in some way, this idea of revolt in the year 66 AD, on the 6th month, on the 6th day. And in doing so, all these years later, whenever the Romans came in and kicked that ass, was found and taken, starved pretty much, whipped. Some even said that he was made to carry that cross from out of where it was made to where it is at the time I'm talking about. But he was so emaciated, and it was a wonder that he lived, that they actually had put him in a tomb. And some say that he was even wrapped in a shroud. But by the power of God, and the miracle of life he lived, and that his daughter, a princess of Magdalena, who used to live in a tower, and has a lot to do with this story about princesses living in dragons and kings kept over time, by the way. Mary, she went to his tomb to see, and arrived late at night, and in doing so they supposedly kept her overnight. And the miracle thing that had happened was that he all of a sudden actually came back to life. They went to go and anoint him, and whenever they did so, he came back to life and looked at him and stood up. It blew their mind, and the ladies came running in that were going to anoint him and put in the scents and all these things so she could come and see her father, as was done. And lo and behold, whenever she went back to see the tomb, she went right up to it and went right past this man that was there. And in her passion and freaking out in the moment and wondering what the hell's going on here, she started screaming, "Where's my father?" Something along that line. And then a voice, which she well recognized, said her name. And in turning around, the person that she had walked past and written off totally was actually her father, King Isis of Edessa, who had risen from the dead, and she didn't recognize him, and it actually took his voice to snap her out of the moment. Some say they kept the shroud that was there, and that actually is the shroud that we see today. Other people want to conflagrate that, and that'd be for a different video, but that probably sounds familiar to some of you listening, and how that idea was kept. Got a lot more of the things that are twisted into this story that we currently still have, but let's go on here a little bit. So they talked about the Middle Ages, and a lot happened during the Middle Ages. In fact, an attempt to turn around and just strip mankind of its memory and look at it in a new way was done, and done again, and done again, and we're going through one now. While extreme damnatio memory is not carried out in modern times, naming or writing about a person falling out of favor is not subject to formal punishment. Less total examples of damnatio memory in modern times include numerous examples of Soviet Union retouching photos to remove individuals such as Trotsky, Yazov. Who is that? Let's see. He would during the Great Purge. Even Stalin, Laurenti Beria, and others, and their fall from favor were removed from articles in the Great Soviet Encyclopedia. So, of course, it's happened in the USSR. Communism really, that got pointed out a long time ago to us. And anybody that read Animal Farm or anything, or anything about 1984 and the concepts that we're not supposed to be looking at as like a playbook or anything. Following the fall of communism in Eastern Europe, many communist statues, particularly of Lenin's statue, were removed from former Soviet satellite states. Following a 2015 decision, Ukraine successfully dismantled all 1,320 statues of Lenin across after its independence, as well as renaming roads and structures named after Soviet authorities. Roads get renamed all the time. Poland. In 19th century, Polish writers often omitted mentioning two kings from the list of Polish monarchs, Bezprym and Wenceslaus III of Bohemia. Well, have you ever heard of the story of King Wenceslaus? It's got a thing to do with Christmas and St. Nicholas and these ideas and stuff that people have long forgotten. But there used to be an old tale that was sung about it. In fact, I hadn't heard the reference in years until all of a sudden I was watching Big Bang, and it came up on that you know, Sheldon somehow knew the song, which was resulted in them being omitted from many later works as well. So, canceled. The treatment of Chinese politician Zhao Ziyang following his fall from grace inside the Chinese Communist Party is regarded as another case of modern damnatio memory. The term also in modern scholarship to color a wide array of official and unofficial sanctions to the physical remnants and memories of deceased individuals and destroyed. Cancel culture. Looking at cases of damnatio memory in modern Irish history, Guy Biner has argued the iconoclastical vandalism only makes martyrs of the dishonored. Yeah, see, that can really happen. Like Jesus becomes a martyr, thus ensuring that they will be remembered for all time. Nonetheless, so sometimes it backfires worse than ever, and it keeps echoing. Nevertheless, Biner goes on to argue that the purpose of damnatio memory, rather than being to erase people from history, was to guarantee only negative memories of those who were so dishonored. See, that's what happens a lot of times too, where they turn around and want to, anything good that they did, they don't want to talk about that. They want to exaggerate, over-exaggerate, and quite often make up things about what was bad. Oh, like Nero just playing fiddle whenever Rome burned and stuff. Fiddles come from later, by the way, but Charles Hendrick therefore proposed that the distinction be made between damnatio memory and the condemnation of deceased person, and the abolitio memory, or abolition of memory, is the actual erasure of another one from historical texts. So you can look up here censorship if you want to look up the term right here. It'll be written down there and the spelling of it in Latin. But how this has happened in a lot of places and so on. In fact, I gave you an example, and one thing that we still have today. Let's take a look through a looking glass here. Here's a place where a portrait was taken away, and all they really did was paint over it with a black cloak. I don't know if I should tell you what this person's name was, because they were supposed to be knocked out of time. Well, it's Venice's Mario Faliero. It became famous because it's all gold gilded nice, and they put it out here rather than just taking the thing away. So you see, it's that. Never mind. Here's coins of Lucius Aelius Sejanus, suffered from damnatio memory following a failed conspiracy to overthrow the Emperor Tiberius. In AD 31, his statues were destroyed and his name obliterated from all public records. Who? Right. So here's a deleted mention of Geta, but you can tell, hey, somebody took out his name, sometimes not done real well, and people can look through that and go, well, that's an L and E, and it was aha. Here's a version of Akhenaten where somebody took his mask and smacked the hell out of it to where the wood that was below it, that was gold gilded over it, was taken away, and they say that's part of it too, but that's just really a stealing of the gold of his mask, so on. That was found in KV 55, though. Here's a place where the memory of Commodus, an inscription of the Museum of History of Osterbrücken. The abbreviation CO was later restored with paint, so you can see where it was. But short of that, there would have just been a dent there. And we're not supposed to talk about that dent, right? Funny, you know what a commode is? Yeah, some of these people, all of a sudden, they twist his name around to something real bad sometimes, or want to associate it with it. Here's a version where a lot of the paintings of somebody was taken out from the Severin family, Septimius Severus, where their son Caracalla and Geta got taken out of most of that pictures that are shown there. So, hey, modern attempts at counterculture, though, can't really take somebody out of record because there's just far too much of that going on. So they really fail a lot of times, and a lot of times that just brings a public to going, well, who are you talking crap about? And then that just props them up even more. And in fact, if a lot of people disagree with you, who's trying to do this type of thing, and agree with them, then that just becomes something where it backfires on you. There's some famous times where this backfired over history. I told you a couple there. Can you name any more? Like, share, and subscribe, and enjoy. We'll go on to a few more times where we can find things in history and some other secrets that sometimes aren't told. Kind of like that Damnatio Memory. I call it fudging through the mist of the reality of the way things were versus what we're told, which kind of has that same feeling, doesn't it? Peace.